I wear multiple hats, both as an active professional musician and a musicologist on one hand, and also as a cultural sociologist. And in this talk, I want to speak first about some concepts of culture, civilization, high and low culture and their meaning today, and in the final part, more specifically, about music. So, as a cultural sociologist, I look at the myriad range of relationships between all types of culture, which is a term I will define presently as I'm using it, and the wider social context they inhabit, in a way which aims to be non-reductive. A view of culture as merely a reflection of or window onto society is just as crude and unhelpful, I believe, as one which denies any relationship between the two. Rather than simply reflecting society, culture adds to society. It creates something unavailable elsewhere. Now, this can, of course, reflect wider social processes and structures, but equally reflect back upon these. And at the same time, it can also inhabit a relatively autonomous realm. So, looking at the dual concepts of culture and civilization, I believe they're linked but not synonymous. Culture is much the older of the two terms. It comes from the Latin cultura, meaning cultivation, care, upkeep, while civilization developed as a concept in the 18th century from the Latin civis, meaning citizen, and civitas, meaning city. But it was probably from around the 17th century that culture came to refer, at least in the West, to some things that we now associate with civilization, progress, and taste. John Milton, in his The Ready and Easy Way to Establish a Free Commonwealth, wrote of the values of schools and academies, to bring up children with learning and education, including in all liberal arts, so this learning would soon spread much more knowledge and civility, yea, religion, through all parts of the land, by communicating the natural heat of government and culture more distributively to all extreme parts, which now lie numb and neglected. And then this developed, and in the 19th century became more strongly linked to the lives of nations and people. Jane Austen wrote in Emma of the character of Jane Fairfax that her heart and understanding had received every advantage of discipline and culture. Now, this conceptual history I'm drawing upon, some of you might recognize it as that developed by the Marxist writer Raymond Williams, which I've not seen any serious reason to doubt. At its broadest, and as regularly used by anthropologists, culture refers to a whole way of life, or at the very least, a range of values, customs, beliefs, rituals, and other practices which are common in a particular environment. I want to use it in a narrower sense, to indicate a body of artistic and intellectual work, some of which might be categorized as high or low, but which has achieved some degree of palpable impact, either past or present, even if to a restricted number of people. In short, culture needs some readers, viewers, listeners, etc. Now, in this context, some considerations related to the concept of civilization, for example, the Freudian concept of civilization as a repression of atavistic instincts, or Norbert Elias's concept of the civilizing process, which he links to state formation, are really beyond the scope, because those both link civilization to that wider conception of culture. Then, the concept of high culture is usually dated back to Matthew Arnold in his Culture and Anarchy of 1867 to 68, where he spoke of the best which has been thought and said in the world, knowledge of which would turn a stream of fresh and free thought upon our stock notions and habits, which we now follow staunchly but mechanically. With the decline of the aristocracy, Arnold believed it was important for the middle classes to gain such culture and pass it on to those classes beneath them. And then 80 years later, T.S. Eliot, writing in a related but somewhat distinct manner in his Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, posited the need for a, quote, organic structure to foster the transmission of culture, which requires persistence of social classes. Now, when high is contrasted with low culture, the latter terms generally conceived as a product of an industrial age and often mass-produced as distinct to folk culture. And as such, low culture then has a particularly strong relationship to capitalist society and folk culture to pre-capitalist civilizations, though high culture has proved durable across both. Now, I date the real debate the contemporary debate around high and low culture as gaining most momentum from the publication of sociologist Herbert J. Ganss's book, Popular Culture and High Culture, An Analysis and Evaluation of Taste, in 1974. This entailed a refusal to view high and low cultures in terms of aesthetic standards, but reformulating them in social terms of taste cultures and taste publics. And this was followed by some more empirical exploration of related phenomena in the writings of Pierre Bourdieu, especially La Distinction in 1979, from which comes the concept of the habitus, things internalized, learned by virtue of being born into a certain class or group, and then onto cultural taste as a product of wider society, an indicator of class or education, which itself can serve to solidify class distinctions through the employment of so-called cultural capital. So, as well as Ganss and Bourdieu, then perhaps the most significant development is through the whole field of cultural studies, which took on a particular flavour from the time that Stuart Hall took charge of the Birmingham School in 1969. An early development there was his theory of encoding and decoding, which placed much agency on the part of spectators, viewers, readers, etc., of intellectual and cultural work. And this was quite at odds with earlier models of such culture as a weapon for manipulation of relatively passive subjects. But nonetheless, that latter dimension remained a consideration within the Birmingham School for a period, as found in such things as their study of mugging in the later 1970s. Now, I locate a really significant shift of emphasis in a 1981 essay by Hall called Notes on Deconstructing the Popular. Here, he definitively rejected any concept of an authentic working-class culture, such as had been posited by his predecessor as director of the Birmingham School, Richard Hoggart. Hall linked such a thing to popular imperialism. And at the same time, he broke with those socialists who were skeptical about the ways in which working people consumed commercial culture and the concomitant view of false consciousness. In line with this, he employed a questionable interpretation of Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemonia, which referred to the use of, in Gramsci's terms, the use of explicit power from above to dominate others and force them to conform to certain cultural and political norms. But in cultural studies, hegemony, and in English, came to mean any set of aesthetic or intellectual values at odds with something that was construed as popular tastes. The possibilities for education, adding something to popular taste, were decried by Hall in terms deriving from Louis Althusser and his view of educational institutions as ideological state apparatuses. Now, I would say an extreme point in this line of thinking was reached in two books published in 1989. John Fiske's Understanding Popular Culture and Andrew Ross's No Respect, Intellectuals and Popular Culture. Fiske presented approaches to consumption, which included wearing of garments, makeup or hairstyles, as somehow forms of guerrilla actions which subvert dominant values. And he claimed that at the point of sale, the commodity exhausts its role in the distribution economy, but begins its work in the cultural. Detached from the strategies of capitalism, its work for the bosses completed, it becomes a resource for the culture of everyday life, a term I really dislike. Ross was even more emphatic in dismissing any sort of defense of high culture. He viewed such defenses as an affront to the values of democracy and a hegemonic attempt by a dominant class to protect their privilege. Now, I would say both Fiske and Ross were, perhaps unwittingly, vehement defenders of the free market at the height of Thatcherism, using the language of hegemony to attack any attempts to modify it. And we should look at the politics of their work accordingly. I will come back to those considerations. But I also want to think about this idea that culture is a civilizing influence. That's come under sustained attack in the 20th century for understandable reasons. George Steiner wrote in his book In Bluebeard's Castle some notes towards the redefinition of culture that, quote, art, intellectual pursuits, the development of the natural sciences, many branches of scholarship flourished in close spatial temporal proximity to massacre and the death camps. It is the structure and meaning of that proximity which must be looked at. Why did humanistic traditions and models of conduct prove so fragile a barrier against political bestiality? In fact, were they a barrier, or is it more realistic to perceive in humanistic culture express solicitations of authoritarian rule and cruelty? I would be sceptical about the last sentence of that, but the rest of it has quite some cogency. And he went on to say in 1984, the spheres of Auschwitz-Birkenau and of the Beethoven recital, of the torture cellar and the Great Library, were contiguous in space and time. Men could come home from their day's butchery and falsehood to weep over Rilke or play Schubert. Earlier on, Walter Benjamin had claimed in his thesis on the philosophy of history that there is no record or document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. I believe Benjamin's statement was hyperbolic rhetoric, but it's harder to argue, I'd say, with the view of Steiner. But I don't think this is a reason to indict specifically high culture. There were certainly prominent Nazis with deep interests in Goethe, Rilke, Schubert and more, but there were plenty of others who resented, for example, being asked to sit through 5 hours of Wagner's Die Meistersinging von Nuremberg prior to a Nuremberg rally. Many, including some who would have been involved in atrocities, may have preferred to listen to German Schlager music or read escapist fiction, as we know that Hitler himself did in the latter case. An attribute commonly associated with high culture is that it can be challenging to the reader, listener, viewer, etc., in ways markedly at odds with the majority of popular or low culture. I would hope it would not be too contentious to argue that James Joyce's Ulysses, which surely benefits significantly from a wider educated cultural background, offers a different sort of experience and view of the world than would be provided by most popular fiction. And even if one's not a fan of Joyce, the same could be said of Dante, Cervantes, Shakespeare, Milton, Blake, the Brontes, Hugo, Leopardi, Baudelaire, Dickens, Dostoevsky, Melville, lots of others. I don't, for that matter, hold any truck with those who try to portray Dickens as simply popular literature. And the conservative historian Dominic Sandbrook has made a similar argument in his book, The Great British Dream Factory. Dickens was a remarkable stylist and craftsman, as well as a highly imaginative and creative constructor of narratives. Some of his work can be quite accessible, but there are still many other dimensions available to the sophisticated reader. I'm coming at this from a position informed to some extent by the work of the Frankfurt School, especially the work of Theodor Adorno, whilst today essentially rejecting quite a lot of the Marxism behind that thought, and certainly the ideas on critical theory by Adorno's collaborator Max Horkheimer, and rejecting most of the work of Herbert Marcuse. Adorno was actually highly critical of a good deal of high culture, sometimes from a rather crude and knee-jerk anti-bourgeois position, but more often in terms of its supposed complicity with his concept of the culture industry. Low culture was far more complicit in this respect, according to Adorno, and most of his writings on the subject are highly deprecatory. Advanced high culture, for Adorno had little time for a reified view of cultural traditions, offered some utopian potential. It could point to realms of experience, perception, sensation, which were not wholly circumscribed by the ideologies and assumptions of the present. And he formulated a particular and somewhat idiosyncratic conception of aesthetic autonomy in this respect. Now, I do think there are plenty of problems with Adorno's view of low culture. Notoriously, in a letter to Walter Benjamin in 1936, he talked about both high and low culture, both bearing the stigmata of capitalism, both containing elements of change, and the famous quote, both are torn halves of an integral freedom to which, however, they do not add up. But that apparently more generous formulation does not appear to have been followed up in many of his subsequent writings. Adorno's all-encompassing Freudian interpretations of the reasons some might choose culture as a form of light entertainment or relaxation reflect, in my view, the view of a control freak who wishes to judge every aspect of people's lives. His association of repetitive music with a castration complex or sadomasochistic urges is classic overinterpretation, and I'd note there are his own documented encounters in the 1940s with a woman in New York of flagellatory inclinations, which he was happy to satisfy, which suggests he should have thought twice before making such a stentorian pronouncement on sadomasochism. His critiques of jazz and popular music employ a narrow set of musical parameters and priorities which preclude consideration of how, say, the highly distinctive and varied sound of Louis Armstrong at the trumpet enables new modes of free expression. But notwithstanding all of that, in his view of how commercial forces fundamentally shape and limit the possibilities for low culture and constrain the possibilities for cultural expression at odds with and perhaps resistant to dominant forms of consciousness, I think his analysis was acute and prescient. It would be a shallow world in which culture produced in accordance with the requirements of short-term market utility was all there was. So I want to defend the importance of high culture, not because I believe it's innately civilizing, but rather because I believe a world without it is intellectually, emotionally, and imaginatively impoverished. And equally because I believe the capacity of such a world to look beyond its own narrow boundaries is limited. Now, there are some contradictions in some conservative positions on culture. A wish to preserve and cherish the best of high culture, a wish I largely share, can conflict with economic policies which leave it to the vagaries of the marketplace. To some extent, varieties of high culture which are long established can survive, though not without difficulty, in the marketplace. But policies of artistic subsidy, which I strongly support, enable access and distribution of these and other culture to wider demographics, and can also facilitate the generation of new forms of challenging culture. But there are no fewer contradictions in leftist positions, especially, once again, some of those associated with cultural studies. On the whole, left-of-centre politics favour subsidy, regulation, intervention in the marketplace, and as such, politics of cultural subsidy have come from this political position. But since the shift around the beginning of the 80s in culture studies that I mentioned, and also a few years later, the formulations on cultural industries articulated by Nicholas Garnham and Jeff Mulgan, who were both then working for the Greater London Council, a view has grown of high culture as serving the interests of an elite, eliding the distinction between social and artistic elitism, and this is unfavourably contrasted with supposedly more inclusive popular culture. Today, I find the latter view is very common, at least in the English-speaking world, and this creates the ironic spectacle, again, of the left at least implicitly advocating market forces as the best guarantee of cultural diversity and inclusivity. Now, part of the title of this session refers to iconoclasm. I would say there have been many examples of iconoclastic arts through different periods of Western cultural history, especially during times of great social change. We talk about the adoption of the seconda pratica in music around 1600, the adoption of folk idioms of poetry by Wordsworth and Coleridge with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads in 1798, Edouard Manet's rejection of established modes of historical representation, or the embrace of the Neue Sachlichkeit in Germany in the 1920s, and whole-scale rejection of earlier modes of expression in both art and music. So his tradition's not an unbroken line of integrative progress, but a history of ruptures, fissures, and more, not all of which necessarily constitute progress. So contemporary iconoclasm may not be so much at odds with that found within tradition, were it not for the fact that other forms of iconoclasm, at least in the last 2 centuries or so, were usually developed from a position of great stylistic and historical cultural knowledge, rendering the work meaningful in such a context. This is equally true of Igor Stravinsky, Marcel Duchamp, Ezra Pound, Virginia Woolf, or Helmut Larkenman. By contrast, young artists, composers, writers who are no longer required to learn much about the traditions which precede them. As such, their iconoclasm can often amount to little more than idle gesture politics and falls flat. Even with a senior figure, well, a late figure now, Maurizio Cargil, who wrote his work Ludwig van in 1970 as a type of critical commentary on the iconic figure which Beethoven had come to be at the time of the 200th anniversary of his birth, especially in West Germany, which is where Cargil spent most of his working life. I'd say there's nothing particularly radical about this, if played to a younger audience who may have never heard a complete Beethoven symphony. Iconoclastic approaches to artistic canons, often from those of older generations who were made to study them when younger, have little meaning to younger generations largely unaware of such canons. So I would say contemporary so-called iconoclasm needs to work much harder and develop wider awareness to actually create an iconoclastic impact in practice. In the context of music, you might easily map high and low culture onto classical and popular, but I would say those categories can be ambiguous. The waltzes of Johann Strauss I and II, or a good deal of operetta, can be conceived as relatively low culture in their time, whilst there were different gradations of high, especially in opera, if you compare Italian opera seria to opera buffa or varieties of non-Italian opera, all attracting different social demographics and understood in that sense. To hear today much opera presented as somehow the most elite of musical art forms is quite ironic when, in many earlier points in history, it was portrayed as vulgar melodrama. I could point to the operas and musicals of Kurt Weill, the musicals of George Gershwin, as areas which operate between the boundaries of the high and low. And the same is true of more recent media such as photography, film, television. The whole tradition of jazz has generated its own range of classics too, and I see no reason not to treat at least some of this as a form of relatively high culture in its own right. To distinguish between music on the basis of whether they were supposedly intended as art or entertainment can be rather futile. Traditions and even canons can be observed in other popular genres, and certainly in non-Western traditions. Music has meaning, but no object, as the pianist and writer Charles Rosen once said. Whilst there is evocative and programmatic music for sure, and even whole languages of musical representation, as some analysts have examined, nonetheless music is not primarily a figurative art form. It can suggest and imply, but never be pinned down or reduced to an external object. I would say that's true of poetic language as well, but even there the sense of an object can be more palpable than for music. There's music with text and theatre, but the specifically musical content of this is frequently more than just a form of decoration of those other factors at best. As such, attempts at didactic, politicized interpretations of music are always problematic, but this has not stopped someone trying. Just a couple of minutes. I see this as part of music's strengths, not a weakness. So in a musical context, I do want to argue in the manner I outlined above for the value of traditions, those which have demonstrated the ability to continue to generate new listeners and responses over a period of time, and which generate new performances and listening interpretations. Once again, some such music does communicate more readily to educated listeners. This can be because of intrinsic difficulties, or sometimes simply because the music inhabits sets of conventions which are historically or geographically remote, as is true for any art form. But there are concerted attacks on the forms of education which might help to overcome some of those difficulties, and others to do with classical music in general. Most obviously is that of cuts of provision of music education of any sort in the UK in the state system, drastically so in the last decade and a half, as any of us who try to recruit students to tertiary musical programs know. And other wider subsidies being cut in the same period, and a lot's been said about that. In education, there are a whole range of attacks on classical music from people coming from the perspective of decolonization, coming from the field of ethnomusicology, coming from popular music studies, all essentially dismissing classical music as nothing more than just an expression of, well, at best, dead white European males, at worst of colonialism, white supremacy, and much more. And there are also attacks coming from within the realms of contemporary music. That's not new. Pierre Boulez in the 1950s notoriously advocated blowing up opera houses. But that was the young firebrand speaking. The mature composer actually ended up conducting a lot of major opera houses of the world. On the whole, radical new music has emerged from within tradition and enacted meaningful breaks, iconoclasms, from this perspective, but which does not preclude drawing also upon other traditions. But we're now seeing the emergence of new generations with little experience of or education in such traditions, but whose work has no more popular appeal than that of their avant-garde predecessors. Nonetheless, they seek, rather pathetically, to replace that classical tradition. If some of you have seen the scene in the film Tar, in which a young conductor's rehearsing a work by an Icelandic woman, which sounds very much of a type with a lot of other contemporary works I've heard, and then is asked about the Bach Mass in B minor by Lydia Tarr, the star of the film. He responds with a dismissal of anything by, I think he says, white male cisgender straight composers. That's a typical piece of rhetoric that's coming from the fields of new music nowadays. all these figures are doing is damage. They're separating out new music from a tradition to which it's undoubtedly indebted and alienating potential audiences for a music which stands no chance of competing on equal terms with its popular alternative. And this is tied to a form of presentism which exceeds earlier historical teleologies in its contempt for the past. But the present always becomes past. And if people only ever learn about a relatively small repertoire from their own time and place, that knowledge will date very quickly. So, I'm wrapping up. A world without cultural traditions is a world without cultural identity. There's absolutely nothing unnatural about focusing on music in the West when we are living here. I'm not going to get into the clash of civilizations thing, which I know there's a session about after this, and I don't feel I'm in a position to start creating hierarchies between different global traditions. I don't know enough about others to say that. But I think it can be argued that Western classical music traditions demonstrate an ability to remain coherent in a plurality of social and cultural settings which exceeds that we've so far witnessed of other traditions, and durable and malleable to repeated and distinctive performances and hearings. I'm no stranger to low culture, as well as having a lifelong interest in popular musics. Often after a hard day's work, I like to relax with an undemanding crime drama or the like. But I'd hate it if that's all there was. At present, the future for a broader cultural realm is under serious threat, especially in music. If we are to remain advanced cultural, intellectual and educated societies, it's paramount for all to oppose this direction as best as they can. Thank you.